What's up, ProGuides family? How are you doing today? I'm Renox, and I'd like to welcome you back to another video. Today, we are going to be discussing 8 aiming secrets that will help you become the best individual player that you can be. Before we do that though, you probably already know what time it is. It's of course time for our question of the day. Today, we'd love to know who you think the best aimer is. Personally, I'd say Nico. His pistol rounds are always just so crisp, and I think he can always change around. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments down below. Before we get into the tips that are really going to change the way you aim, firstly, we'd like to get into understanding aim, knowing why you need to be able to aim and what are its limitations. Firstly, there are 2 main ways of aiming, which are tracking, following a moving target, be it a player who is running across your screen, or a wall if you're pre-aiming angles, and also flicking. Flicking is when you snap to an opponent because they're not directly in your crosshair. Tracking is something that you can do consistently as long as you put in adequate practice, but with flicking, that's not so much the case. Sure, you could still practice flicking, in fact you definitely should, but you're never going to achieve 100% consistent flicks. You might be able to go from a 40% success rate to an 80% one at a certain distance, but there will always be that chance that you'll either overflick or underflick. The reason we mention this is because we want you to realize that you can't and shouldn't rely on flicks. It's too inconsistent, and if you're having a bad day aim-wise, you'll really suffer. That being said, you also don't really want to rely on your tracking ability to carry in aim fights, because if you do that, you'll likely be dead before you can even put the crosshair on the enemy. What you do want to rely on is your crosshair placement, having your crosshair already on the spot your opponent's head will be before you even see him. If you're peeking an angle, preemptively aim at the spot where you think his head will be. If instead you're holding an angle, make sure to place your crosshair where your opponent will peek. This way, you don't have to do any aiming and you'll just have to click mouse 1. Unlike what many people think, Counter-Strike is not a game about aiming. Rather, it's a game about aiming as little as possible. In theory, as a CSGO player, you'll only ever need to aim when an opponent really catches you off guard, or if you're running into a site first as the entry fragger, as you'll be unable to pre-aim all the angles. This is something you should really think about. Yes, aiming is a really important skill to practice, because with good aim, you'll be able to get kills that you shouldn't be able to get, especially if your opponent messes up, but that right there is exactly its purpose as well, capitalizing on your opponent's mistakes and winning fights that you had no business winning. Instead, the most important skill is crosshair placement. As with perfect crosshair placement, you should realistically win every fight. This is something you should deeply understand in order to not develop bad habits. Something we see often is players with above average aiming skill not being able to get out of their rank, and that's mostly because these players have just developed bad habits. If you can just out-aim anyone at your rank, you won't be worried too much about taking favorable fights or perfect crosshair placement. You won't even realize you are taking those bad fights and that your crosshair placement isn't on point, as you're just winning fights regardless. But as soon as you're about to rank up and play against players with similar aiming skills, just without those bad habits, you're likely to get destroyed and blame it on a bad game. Aim is not as important as a lot of players think, so when you're practicing it, know what you're getting into. You're practicing your aim so that you can win an extra fight here and there that you probably should not have won. Another thing we'd like to mention is that although pros have some amazing aiming ability, they're not pro because their aim is the best. Some time ago, a CSGO YouTuber, Time Is But a Window, was actually playing a Face-It game against 2 100 Thieves players, Jacob and AZR. Of course, the pros here were just playing for fun and therefore went for a lot of aim fights, but that resulted in Time Is But a Window initially winning. He was able to out-aim the pros somewhat consistently. After a while though, the pros decided to actually try winning the game and stopped giving him those free fights. Instead, they played around their utility and teammates started destroying him. I think this illustrates quite well that pros aren't pros because of their aim, but because they know how to play CS, which isn't just an aiming game, unlike what some people might think. Now that you really understand aiming and what it's needed for, let's get into how to improve your aiming real fast. Starting with some advice on getting the right peripherals. Getting the right gear is very important in CS. If you're using a mouse that is too big or small for your hands, you'll not only feel uncomfortable holding it, but possibly also develop some sort of permanent damage to your hand, like carpal tunnel for instance, which we don't want of course. If your keyboard or mouse feels uncomfortable, you should probably try something new. Don't just look at what your favorite pro is using and buy that. It is very likely their hands are very different from yours. Instead, go to your local electronics store and try as many mice as you want and decide which one feels best for you. Then leave it there and buy it online. It's probably cheaper there anyways. And yeah, we know there's quite a lot of debate online as to which mice are the best and which mouse is the easiest to aim with, but in reality, that doesn't matter. If you're using the best aiming mouse, but you're not comfortable using it, you'll perform much worse than you would if you were using the worst mouse to aim with, but you liked using it.
With gear, it really comes down to personal preference, so we just advise trying as much as possible and seeing what you like best. If you love using a certain mouse or keyboard, that'll definitely be the best to aim with, at least for you anyways. Much like how we said you shouldn't copy the gear of your favorite pro player, the same goes for settings. A lot of players, and admittedly I've been guilty of this myself, like to think that if you copy your favorite pro player's settings, you'll suddenly be able to inherit all of their skills and play at their level. After using common sense for 2 minutes, scientists have realized that this is actually not the case. If anything, it just hinders your muscle memory. Therefore, copying settings is not advised either. Seriously though, copying other people's settings won't do you anything and will only really hinder you in the long term. When it comes to settings, you should just use whatever you find comfortable and think you can stick with. Sure, looking at pro settings can be used to get some guidelines as to what is proven to work. Whether it's high or low sensitivity, there's outliers on both ends. Basically, there's not one setting that is perfect and that everyone should use. Instead, it's a mixture of personal preference, what gear you're using, and your body. So the best thing to do is experiment and find something that works for you. Now let's hop in game and start talking about game sense and how it relates to crosshair placement. Great crosshair placement can be achieved by playing a lot, practicing your crosshair placement purposefully, and watching a lot of demos. The more experience you'll gain, the more you'll feel where players are. After a while, you'll not only be able to predict standard angles, but you'll also feel like your spider senses are tingling when someone is playing an off angle, and you'll even know where they should be. This is not something that's often talked about, but it's definitely something you should consider. Whenever you get the strong feeling that someone could be somewhere, don't be afraid to trust your guts and hard clear that exact spot. Personally, after quite a few thousand hours of playing CSGO, I sometimes don't even clear spots where technically my opponent could be, just because I feel so strongly that they are in another specific spot. Sometimes I'll be wrong and it'll get me killed, but more often than not, I'm right, and I'll be able to pick up an easy kill. If you ever feel that an opponent could be somewhere, I'd advise you to really trust that feeling, even if it might cost you. This way, you're really able to build your experience, and you'll also become less predictable yourself because you aren't just playing the standard way. Another thing that a lot of players struggle with is having bad days, and the truth is everyone has good games and also bad games. Good games are always fun because it seems like no matter how stupid you play, it kind of just works, but bad games are definitely a lot less fun. Oftentimes, people who are having a bad game will try to turn it around and try to force themselves to have a good game instead. They might try to do some stupid peek that worked that one time they did it, and then it just doesn't. That's where accepting and adapting comes in. This concept was first talked about by Alige on the DDK Talks Esports podcast, and later he also talked about Styko more in depth. He talked about A games, B games, and C games. When you're having a good day and seem to be hitting everything, you're playing your A game. When you can go for some more aggressive plays and really control the game, if you're playing your B game, it's just your average game. You hit some shots occasionally, but you consider your performance to be normal. And lastly, there's your C games. These are the games where you can't seem to hit a guy not even looking at you. We won't go too in-depth about it here, but if you'd like to hear more about it, we can make a separate video. So make sure to let us know down below if that's what you desire. But basically, what it comes down to is adapting your playstyle based on how you're able to aim that day. You'll want to try and recognize this as early as possible so that you can play accordingly, so that no matter how bad a day you're having, you still are able to perform reasonably well. Something else you'll want to consider is where you're positioning yourself, making sure you're positioning yourself for success. Sure, you can always play a really difficult angle and then get angry that your aim let you down, but why would you? Always try to play the angles that you feel the most comfortable with and that you think that you can get kills from. But at the same time, don't be scared to experiment, as you might just find that new goofy off angle that will get you consistent kills in the future. If you do find some good angles on all the areas of each map, then decide which ones you like the most and play them. If you hate playing on default A-Site Mirage, then don't. No one is forcing you to. Sure, you might have seen a pro get a highlight from there, but that doesn't matter. Just play angles you're confident in and you'll quickly see your kills rise. Aside from positioning, you should also consider the speed at which you're aiming. A lot of players will, when they're first starting to play, really try to improve their aiming speed. They will see how fast the pros aim and want to adopt that. Doing this though will create the bad habit of aiming too fast and not going for headshots. When you're starting out with playing, or even if you've been playing for a while but you feel like you're not headshotting enough, try to slow down your aim and focus on accuracy first. Doing this will feel tedious, but it will also make sure that you develop much stronger aiming fundamentals and will help you massively later on in your career. I personally was one of the players that is guilty of not doing this right the first time, and nowadays I still need to spend time on fixing that habit or else I'll go back into my old ways. So the earlier you start doing this, the better. Lastly, and probably most importantly, we have practice, practice, practice. If you really want to get the best aim possible, there's only one way to really go about it, and that's practicing. We've already actually made a great video on this, and it's called How to Win Every Duel and Hit the First Shot. So we'd highly recommend watching that one as well, but basically try to work on all the areas of your aim that you're the most weak at, and you'll see rapid improvement. Well guys, that's going to be all for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it, so if you did, make sure to let us know by leaving a like, subscribing, and don't forget to hit that notification bell in order to never miss out on a chance to improve again. And lastly, but certainly not least, make sure to head on over to ProGuides.com. On there, we offer some of the world's best coaching so that you can truly unlock your full potential, as well as the one and only simple master course to Counter-Strike. With that, I wish you a great rest of your day and best of luck in improving.